A lot of us, and probably a lot of you, read that powerful piece in the Globe and Mail this weekend. Hadiya Roderique wrote about what it's like to be a black woman on Bay Street. The piece was raw, and it cast a harsh light on how we aren't nearly as accommodating as many of us like to think we are. The story left us here at On the Money with a lot of questions. Questions about hiring and about workplace culture and how we can all do better. And we're going to get to some of those, but I want to start with Hadiya Roderique, who joins me now in studio. Nice to see you. Thank you for writing this piece. I wonder what made you want to write it now?
So I actually started out writing a completely different piece. I meant to write a piece on hiring because I'm doing my PhD in organizational behavior and human resources management at Rotman. And I noticed that some of the strategies that Bay Street firms still use for hiring are sort of a little bit behind the times in terms of what the research says is best.
And I mean, I was saying to you off camera that it was in my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, but in my coffee shop and when I was dropping my kids off at swimming, everybody seemed to be talking about this weekend. I know some of the major law firms on Bay Street also sent it out as required reading for their lawyers and associates. Who did you write this for? And I mean, we always write it for ourselves, but who was your intended audience?
My dad.
Yeah?
Partially for my dad, but just partially for anyone who didn't fit in or felt like they were different. And hopefully could relate to something in my piece. And I've had people from all walks of life who've been able to find something and have sent me emails and stories, and I think it's just a piece about belonging, like where do we belong and how do we belong?
Can you just sum it up for us? What is it like to be a black woman? You know, because you talk about the difference between the experience of a black man or a white woman being a black woman on Bay Street. What was that like?
Well, you have the intersectionality of your gender and your race. And so, you know, I get the penalties of my gender and I get the penalties of my race. So if I am too loud or I'm too sassy, I'm seen as the angry black woman. Or if I try the same behavior in a man would be seen as sort of him being a go-getter
or whatever it may be.
So kind of having to manage what people's expectations are of you and knowing what the stereotypes are out there and sort of a lot of impression management, I'd say.
It gets to how we identify ourselves. I mean, Canadians are a pretty smug lot. We think we're very multicultural. We think we've got a lot of this, you know, down, and that we're very accommodating. And I think when we read this, we find ourselves thinking, well, wait a second, what is going on here? Do you think most Canadians understand what's happening and why some of these things are happening?
Well, I had someone on my feed say, don't bring racism into Canada. And I was like, sweetie, it's already here. Yeah. I think we have a tendency to compare ourselves to the States. Right. And so we see things like shootings of black men, and we see sort of more overt racism and tend to think that we're better. But we are just as bad and sometimes worse in a lot of measures. I think more black men are carded in Toronto than through the program that happened in New York, through the frisking program. So
quite something right there.
Yeah.
As you say, you're now doing your PhD and still looking at hiring practices. What do you hope comes from this?
I hope that next year's Bay Street recruitment, because it's happening right now. It's interview week. I hope that the interviews are different next week. I'd love to see blind resumes. I'd love to see standardized questions. I'd love to see people asking about experiences and not just coffee shop chit-chat.
Right.
Yeah.
You talk in the piece about that struggle that you had, that internal struggle of wanting to stay and affect change from within and being there for the next generation of young kids that are coming up today and needing to leave and go off and do the academic thing that you're doing now, where you can affect change too. Do you still struggle with that, about sort of, you know, having left it behind and where you can affect the best change from?
It's hard to be the first. I would have been the first black woman partner at Faskin's, and, you know, there are very few black women partners at law firms. And it's hard to be the first. It's, you know, there's no one to look up to.
Right.
And it requires some part of like self-sacrifice,
totally.
I think. So, but I think I'm a better translator than I am.
And I guess that's it. Like, do you think you can affect the same level of change on the academic side by looking at this, by prompting exactly this conversation? I mean, here we are on a business show talking about.
I mean, hopefully there's going to be a change in hiring practices. I don't think I would have had that same change on multiple law firms if I just stayed at one place.
Well, listen, thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming in. And we're going to have a more broad conversation still, but I want to really thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Hadiya Roderique is a former Bay Street lawyer, now PhD candidate in organizational behavior at the Rotman School of Management. For another perspective on diversity on Bay Street, I'm joined by Ritu Bhasin. She is president of the Bhasin Consulting. She's a former Bay Street lawyer herself, a former legal talent director at Stikeman Elliott, and author of the Authenticity Principle. Sorry, I can't speak today, Ritu.
I guess
my first question for you is what can and what should Bay Street firms today, as we said, hiring week is happening right now. What can they be doing to do better on this?
So the first is a recognition that Hadiya's experience is in fact the experience of many people from underrepresented communities. We know from research, and I can talk to you more about some hot off the press research that will be out next week. We know from research that women of color in particular, bringing in intersections, feel like conformity is the way to get ahead in corporate Canada, that in order to succeed, in order to advance, they need to alter aspects of how they behave and also even potentially hide who they are in order to get ahead.
We've talked on this show before about some of the options that especially big firms have, whether it's blind hiring, there's all kinds of options out there. Why is there such a reticence on the part of big firms, on the part of sort of, Bay Street, Wall Street firms to take some of those up?
So I mentioned research coming out. We know from leading research that we just conducted in corporate Canada that over 40% of people of color and over 60% of Indigenous peoples feel that leadership presence is measured by conforming to a white male normative. This means that people of color and Indigenous peoples feel like they have to conform and become like white men in order to advance. And so despite there being a vocalized commitment to creating more inclusive cultures in corporate Canada, the lived experience is that a white male normative continues to permeate and dominate systems of advancement. And until those systems are dismantled, people of color and Indigenous peoples will continue to lag behind. In other words, there's a lot of talk in this space, but very little actual systemic and individual change that will result in helping people to get ahead who are from underrepresented communities.
And yet, I hear from people on Bay Street, on Wall Street, in big firms that are allies, that do want to help, old white guys like me that want to be allies. What can we do? Somebody who works in an office who maybe has some small role to play in this, is it about stepping up? Is it about speaking out? What can the allies in this do?
So I, too, spent a lot of time working with the white guys in my consulting practice, and I would say that there are a few key steps that allies can embrace. First of all, a recognition that there are conscious and unconscious biases about people we put in our outgroups, people who are not like us, that cause us to question their analytical abilities, their ability to connect with us, and their ability to work very hard. And so the first step is recognizing that every single person has biases, that you have biases, identifying what they are, and then paying attention to where they show up. The next step is to overtly, directly, and in a very positive way, outreach to people across lines of difference to ask them about how they need to be supported, and then to go out there and help to open up doors, to advocate for promotions, to talk people up. We already know that leaders do this, but leaders usually do this across lines of sameness. And the challenge is that in corporate Canada, the senior leadership ranks continue to be homogeneous. They're dominated by men, older, white, straight, able-bodied men. And given the natural, unconscious hardwiring to gravitate towards sameness, so gravitate to people who are like us, it means that these older white men are sponsoring, mentoring people, providing their support and advocacy across lines of sameness. So that has to change, which means people taking proactive steps to help to advocate for people who are not like them.
Well, listen, I hope we can all do better, and I hope that's some advice that people will follow. Ritu, thanks for this.
Thank you for having me.
Ritu Bhasin, president of Bhasin Consulting, a former Bay Street lawyer and author of The Authenticity Principle.